Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today we're going to be talking all things language with Dr. Kathryn Johnston and Professor Joe Baker. Welcome both. Great to have you on.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks so much. Excited to be here.
Well, I am super excited to be speaking about a topic close to my heart, language. I'm a psychologist, so I'm really fascinated by language and its impact on behavior and development and performance in sport. And so we're going to be unpacking a paper you've both written. But before we get on to that, let's do some introductions. Dr. Kathryn Johnston, Katie, it's great to have you on for the first time. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, thanks so much for being here. I know there's no visual component, but I am smiling ear to ear in honor of being here. So that's so great. I'm also really happy that you asked me to go first so that my CV isn't compared to Joe's lengthy one. But I'll be brief because it is. But a little bit about me is a sport enthusiast. Never reached those podiums, but certainly love to dabble. Trying winter sports, summer sports, team sports, individual sports. Really loved it all. And that led me to ask a lot more questions than I had answers to about how people reach the top. And then, of course, I met Joe about a decade ago, and then he's been stuck with me ever since. So master's work dove a little bit into talent identification. We actually work with golf, which I know you're quite familiar with, and looking at some of their systems. And then we still had more questions than we had answers to. And we dove right into PhD, which explored a little bit more of this notion of like, what is talent? What does it mean in the context of sport and sport development? But then also asking questions around how do our psychological processes, things like biases, heuristics, kind of like quirks of the brain, how does that play into things like decision making for selection, how we program for athlete development? So try to unpack a little bit more, and we're still doing that now in some postdoctoral work in the lab, which has been a lot of fun.
Sounds like you've done a lot of work around this idea of talent. What drew you to that specific topic in your education pathway?
Well, maybe simply that I never thought I had it, and was really
Join the club
wanted to
there.
know. Yeah. It's the more I learn about it, just the more I'm interested in this idea of who thinks they have it, what is it, who has it, and why is it there. But it was that easy coming to for some people that they had an ability to achieve, whether it was academically or athletically, and that had a lot more areas for exploration than it did for just like a simple answer. And so in the context of sport, what we found is it was just like a snowball. the more we asked, the less we kind of had clarity, and then that kind of led to the path we've been on now, which has been kind of cool and interesting and also overwhelming at times. But we're here for that adventure.
It's such a fascinating and sometimes controversial topic, isn't it? And before we come to Joe, I mean, Katie, you said you were a huge, a sports nut, perhaps. I mean, it sounds like you widely sampled a number of sports. No early specialization for you, but what was there any particular sport that you played more than any other?
Well, I'll show off my Canadian roots a little bit here, but curling was actually my competitive sport
Oh, wow.
for the longest time,
Okay.
and really enjoyed that. And actually, still have some fellow curlers who are in the professional level, which is really exciting to see. But I really also love the individual sports, and distance running really opened my eyes up to a community, an environment that I love to really take part in. And I'm fortunate. It's not a requirement for the Baker Lab, but it seems to be that we've got this group of like distance runners, trail runners, folk. And so that is just that's kept the interest going, and a little bit of competition within the lab, but still really enjoying some adventures through distance running.
And so my final question here, comparing curling with distance running from a psychological perspective, I mean, two completely different, both very psychological, but I'd be keen to get your comment on which you thought suited your brain best and why.
That's such a good question. I've never thought of that in this context. Well, curling is such a game of chess that
Yeah.
you're planning from strategy
Okay.
3, 4 shots ahead. So your brain, it's an endurance sport for the brain.
Yeah.
And that's really cool. You don't really have a lot of time to think about much else. So
Mm.
from that perspective, like you're really doing a lot of planning and decision making. For distance running, I didn't reach the really competitive levels, but when I'm there, it's the endurance for the body. So I'm trying to tame my brain instead of engage it in kind of those ways to say like, we're here for the journey. You know, you're trying to map out like your reasons of why, and just trying to kind of stick through some really tricky parts. But for me, they were so different in really nice complementary ways. And I think it would be really lovely to get back into curling to, well, A, for the off season, B, because it's intensely social and a lot of fun, but also I think just to engage that kind of decision making brain a little bit as well.
Well, it's certainly when I go for a run, I'm constantly wondering why I'm going for a
Yeah,
run when I'm
that's
absolutely
right.
exhausted.
Yeah, you need to almost write them on the arm so you can just like glance down just in case you forget.
Well, this is it. It's a good psychological strategy. Write it on the back of your hand. Absolutely. So delighted to have you on, Katie. Professor Joe Baker. Great to have you back on. And it's not been long since you've been on talking about your amazing book, Tyranny of Talent, which I enjoy so much unpacking with you. How are you, sir? Tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us what's been going on.
Thanks, Dan. It's good to be back. Yeah, I'm Joe Baker, a professor at York University in Toronto. I've been there coming up to 20 years. And yeah, it's Katie basically described our research program, which is talent focused. How do we understand it? How do we identify it? How do we nurture it? Which seem like simple questions, but they're immensely complicated. And the biggest thing, which I think is what we're going to try to unpack today, is how do we clarify what the heck we're even talking about when we open that can of worms.
Absolutely, absolutely. And how long's it been since your book Tyranny of Talent was published? Has it been about 6, 8 months
No, I think about 6 months. Came out at the end of November.
now? Okay. Any, because I know what it's like in that first sort of 6 months, 12 months, writing. You've written your book. You've unleashed it to the world. How are you feeling about it right now? I mean, I know how well it's been received. I've loved every minute of it, reading it. But what are your thoughts now, six months later after releasing it?
I was so pleased. It's a little anxiety inducing to think about releasing it to the world because it's a different kind of beast than a typical academic
Yeah,
textbook. You're putting yourself out there. But I'm so glad I did it. I'm working on maybe the next one or the next two at the moment, and now it's just finding time because it's something that you do on the side of your desk as opposed to being a primary
of
focus.
course.
But just fantastic. The feedback I've gotten has been very rewarding, and yeah, the albatross around my neck at the moment is recording the audio version. But like most people, I cannot stand the sound of my own voice. So if I listen to anything on playback, I basically go back to the drawing board and recreate it from scratch. So hopefully that's my job for the next month, is to get that audio version done.
That's no mean feat, and it's something I withdrew from. I let somebody else record the audio for one of my books. Well, look, we are, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to unpack a paper you've both written, led by yourself, Katie, and this paper is entitled Language Games and Blurry Terminology. Can clarity enhance athlete development? And as I mentioned earlier, this is something that fascinates me. Language, as a psychologist, fascinates me. Language in terms of behavior management, behavior change, communication between key stakeholders in sport, the meaning behind language. I think it's absolutely fascinating. And what I know from my work, from my consultancy practice, is we can in sport get ourselves in a real mess, a real muddle, because we attach different meanings, don't we, to different words, different phrases. We play language games essentially, and so I'm really keen to unpack this paper with you both. Katie, coming to you first, and we've talked about talent and your passion for unpacking talent, and you mentioned in your biography there that the whole of coaching science and sports psychology is an interest and a passion for you. But where did the interest in language and the relevance of language come into your work? Give us a bit of a feel for the genesis of this paper.
Absolutely. It's really part of a broader research program that we have underway because we're realizing that undefined or vaguely defined terms are really that catalyst, like you mentioned, for confusion. And that can be really difficult from both a research and a practice perspective. And so part of this was recognizing that challenge and then seeing if we can work towards maybe more conceptual clarity. And I think what really sparked it for me personally, and maybe for Joe too, was that we we had heard this term talent, we had heard it being used different ways, and we decided to investigate that a little bit further. And we wanted to know, with a group of distance running coaches, all from Canada, all males, roughly within the same number of years that they have been coaching at the highest level, what do they think about talent? But what we wanted to do, instead of probing and asking that outright, which can be a little forward and perhaps maybe leading at times, we asked them a question. Tell us about some of the best athletes that you work with. And of our 10 coaches, 9 mentioned the word talent, and sometimes again and again and again, which was a perfect invitation for us to ask a little further. Interesting, you said that word talent. What does that mean to you? And so what was really cool is, of 9 coaches, we had 9 beautiful, unique definitions with, their own, their own nuance and also their experience kind of woven in. And this was really interesting, and perhaps also adding to the confusion is that there were a lot of synonyms used, like gift or potential, athleticism. So again, words that maybe are equally as nebulous and confusing at times. But what it showed us was that we are at an important juncture for creating some clarity when these words have importance for things like measurement precision, maybe also things like selection. When someone's either going to stay in a system or not, that clarity around what talent is and how we can measure it maybe should be there. Because if 4 different people have 4 different definitions of talent, then maybe the answer isn't that person had talent or not to be selected. Maybe we can be a little bit more precise in that. And that's not only helpful from an organizational perspective, but probably also for the athlete, because now they're having maybe more insight into ways to improve or what it would take to get there or reasons perhaps that it wasn't a good fit. But because of this, that language, that blurriness might not always be super helpful. And I'm sure you probably see this in the psychology side when you said that exact term, like grit or toughness or like those key words there. That can really, I'm sure, interfere with that connection with someone or a group.
Well, you've mentioned some words there like grit and toughness, and in the paper you've unpacked a few words which we'll speak to later. Coming to you, Joe, I mean, it is remiss of me to not mention that this language has huge implications for research, doesn't it? Because as a practitioner, as a consultant, I'm thinking about this from a consistency perspective at the coalface. But equally, I'm also aware that as a consultant, I want to be evidence grounded, evidence informed, evidence driven. But if I look at the evidence and maybe that evidence has an enormous inconsistency of definition across key terms, then how can I be consistent as a practitioner? So language really has, language and the definition of terms has important implications for researchers and for consultants, and subsequently, therefore, for coaches and performers. Joe.
Yeah, I agree. And you hit the nail on the head when you started with this discussion of evidence based or evidence informed, because that's the world we live in now, that the quality of your argument is based on the quality of your evidence. And so when we went back and sort of peeled the curtain and looked at what the quality of the evidence for some of these things like talent, like early specialization, like what does elite mean as a term? Well, the inconsistency in how those things are used undermine the quality of the evidence base that we have in research. So that has implications for researchers. It has implications for practitioners like yourselves, coaches. It certainly has implications for policy that we're using more and more to control access to resources and the way that we treat athletes in our development system. And so this lack of clarity in terms of the word we use, or this inconsistency and blurriness, has implications for almost every element of the sport program because of the culture that we live in now, which is so focused on evidence.
I want to return to something, actually a word that you mentioned, Katie, and that word was unique. That the coaches that you had a conversation with around this term talent had their own unique definition or their own unique experience of talent. So they had a unique structure to how they defined talent. I suppose almost to challenge the point we're making, isn't it a wonderful thing to have different definitions? Isn't it a wonderful thing to have this rich, broad landscape of differing definitions rather than this one defined, controlled definition of a single term across the landscape of coaching? I'm sort of throwing a grenade in straight away. I'm sure you'll bat it away quite comfortably, but I'm just I was captivated or captured by your term of unique. I mean, I'm thinking of sport. Sport is based on uniqueness, on individuality, as well as teamwork. Is it not useful to have a rich landscape of definitions rather than this single classification of a term?
Such great points there. And what we know about language is that it is constantly evolving and shaping with culture, with time, with space. So we know it to be in a state of flux. And so there is some beauty, I think, in certain contexts to have that diversity, to capture maybe more individual notions of ideas or constructs. I also consider in this sport landscape, perhaps in the context of development or elite sport, there are certain times and priorities where things like measurement, precision, or organizational alignment, where maybe more isn't more. I'm thinking in this context of, let's say, early specialization, work done in our lab by Sandy Mosier and alongside Joe and a couple others, was focusing on like just defining what that means. Because if we're saying we want young athletes to be early specializers, or maybe we don't, do we even have a set definition of what that means? When is early? How specialized, if it's under the same sport umbrella or if it's closely connected. And so from a prescription standpoint, when we're putting on our research hats and our science hats, I think it's important, and I think we think it's important to really think about if we can't define something, then we probably can't measure it. And if we can't measure it, we probably can't analyze its use. And if we can't analyze its use, maybe it doesn't deserve a place in systems that are so data centric, that are looking for that 1% gain, that maybe that's not that helpful.
Throwing the same question to you, Joe. I mean, I know you're somebody who will be communicating with coaches across a range of sports, and I know myself, having worked across a range of sports, context matters. Is what you're asking here almost an impossibility? Because every sport is going to have its own language. And yes, we can have repeatable words like talent or confidence or character. But even then, context can be king. That people grab hold of. Golfers grab hold of the language that they use in their context. And if I think about, being a professional golfer, I'm not concerned at 8, 9, 10 years old as compared to, say, somebody who's keen to be an elite swimmer. There's slightly more pressure on that person when they're very, very young, and so subsequently, that's shaping the language. It's shaping behaviour, but it's also shaping language, and so subsequently, is what you're asking for here even possible?
Yeah, it's I think we need to have this conversation because we don't know that. At the moment, I think we're looking at all forms of language at the same level of analysis, assuming that either they're undefinable or they're infinitely definable. And there's probably a lot of variables that fall in between those two extremes. But we won't know unless we have the conversation. We won't know which ones are more volatile in different contexts until we have that conversation. I think, we operate on these two extremes. One is the scientific method, which assumes that we can capture and measure every element in the universe. And the other is that the world is an unpredictable, chaotic system, so we shouldn't try to measure anything. I think there is a middle ground that we need to arrive to. It doesn't mean we're going to solve all the problems, but we need to know which problems are solvable and move towards solving those ones while identifying the ones that are maybe more chaotic or unpredictable, at least at this point in time. I think that's, for me, if you look at the research that's happened in our field over the last 20 or 30 years, we've seen massive amounts of research input and support. I think we're at a point now where precision is mattering, where measurement quality matters, where the quality of evidence is emerging again as being really important. Well, those things are based on clarity of language. Even if the clarity is, we can't define this term. We shouldn't use talent because it's undefinable and it's inconsistent. And okay, well, that tells us something about how we write better policy. We don't use those words. That's still a fruitful discussion to have from our perspective.
If therefore we're passionate about improving conceptual clarity, how do we start doing this? Is there a starting point, or is this just an ongoing conversation? Katie, what are your thoughts there?
Well, I was pointing to Joe because I figured he's got a long list, but we've bounced around this idea. Like, we're aware that this might be an ongoing battle, but for the right reasons. So we're here to be part of that, I think, journey. But what I do think too is that it won't come from any one person at any one time. It's going to take the masses, because what we know is what we'll use the word talent again here for lack of a better term, but what we know about talent here doesn't necessarily mean the same things with our colleagues in Germany who are looking at talent in similar but perhaps different ways as well. So will we find a universal term that is accepted by all? Probably not. But what we can do is work or think like an Oxford Dictionary, which is it's a go-to, maybe respectable and reliable combination of words to define critical or vague language, and that can be helpful. But with the caveat that it's at one point in time by this group of people, which we know will be changing over time with different groups of people with different experiences. So we think that might be helpful. It could be an option. We've explored the notion of using a Delphi study where we're contacting different coaches, practitioners, researchers, pretty much any folks that are involved with the word talent to provide insight and to capture those great discussions that have those nuances and those intricacies and maybe quote, quote, unique perspectives to arrive at something that maybe is more of a consensus statement or a couple. What we know is that we hold different philosophical views and paradigms than other researchers. So to think that one might fit for everyone is probably unrealistic as well. So kind of appreciating that there will be different views for that.
I love that idea of an Oxford Dictionary of sporting terms. I just think that would that would be awesome. Playing on that idea. I mean, a question to both of you, because you do throw in a few terms in your paper here that you use as examples of uh, ambiguous terms or terms that have become ambiguous in our industry. Let's play about with this. So, for example, you use the word elite, you unpack the word elite. Again, to either of you here, can you speak to your concern of the word elite, its ambiguity within sporting circles, and we can build from there.
Sure. I should have mentioned this earlier. A lot of this work comes out of the conversations and discussions we've had with our colleagues on this
Yeah.
paper, Alex McAuley and Adam Kelly. And Alex led a paper that we did a few years ago on this idea of elite and the problematic use that it was having at that time. And that time was during the COVID pandemic, where the word elite actually meant something for which athletes actually get access to resources and which ones have to stay home and can't train. So this word, all of a sudden, which was being used in vague and inconsistent ways, was being used in very specific ways to a very specific cohort of people, all of which wanted access to resources. And so this is the kind of real world implications of this blurry terminology is people will take the terminology and force a definition to it, and we have the option of controlling the way that word is used, or we can let policymakers and maybe people with less expertise and more vested interests to control the use of those terms. And so for us, this was a wake-up call in terms of, hey, as a research community, we should probably get our acts together and make sure people are using these terms the way we want them to be used. And Dan, you probably, like, the word aggression went through this same kind of evolution. Everybody in coaching circles was using aggression in inappropriate ways. And we had to have conversations with people and say, no, you're not talking about aggression. You're talking about assertiveness. You're talking about intensity. Aggression is a very clear thing from a research perspective. We can have those conversations if we can decide what the variables or what the concepts actually mean from a measurement standpoint. The Oxford English Dictionary, I think, is an interesting example because words don't have single uses. Like, it might be a noun that has three different forms. In this context, it means this. In this context, it means that. It doesn't force us into a specific definition. There is room for variability, but it does require us to be able to identify all those variabilities to lay them down on paper.
Really fascinating stuff, and actually, it was remiss of me more than you, Joe. I didn't mention that your co-writers on this paper are Alexander McAuley and Adam Kelly. So thank you for mentioning that, and my apologies there. I think it's fascinating that you unpack this term elite and its ambiguity and how it impacted decisions during COVID. And I can think of, Twitter is certainly a place where the word elite brings up a lot of emotions for coaches because, I think when some coaches see advertisements for our elite under eights, there's often some very, very angry at that and some sensitive to that. So I think the term elite evokes quite a strong emotional response across sport, especially when you're talking about young people. But the point being is that these terms are, the way they're unpacked does shape behavior. They really, really do, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the areas of research that we have maybe the least exploration of, but maybe the greatest potential for value is the power of these terms in shaping behavior during young performers. We know almost nothing about being called talented when you're young and what that does to motivation and feedback. Does it make it better? Does it make it worse? You could go either way in terms of the hypothesis. Because does it, from a growth mindset perspective, being told you're talented might actually undermine your interest in practice. But it might keep you involved for longer because somebody's told you something that's positive in terms of feedback. We have almost zero, not in sport, not in gifted education, not in math and science, the power that these words have in shaping long-term development and interest and motivation. But we have to think that they have power. It's there waiting for someone to explore. And so hopefully we're, like I said at the beginning, peeling the lid off this giant can of worms that it's going to be impossible to put the lid back on.
You also unpack the term character, which I think this really resonates with me because I have historically had coaches of adult elite teams speak to me about, I want a team with character, I want players with character. And it's interesting what you've written here in your paper, actually challenging the viewpoint around character. And there's a cultural fluence here. You speak to individualistic societies versus collectivist cultures, and actually how culture can impact behavior and subsequently the interpretation of character. I think that's absolutely fascinating, and one for me to certainly go back to coaches and say, well, hang on, who's in your team? What are their interpretations of what character looks like?
Yeah, I think the character one is an interesting example of these kind of words that are commonplace in a bunch of different sports settings. And the reality is these words have different meanings for different people. One of the greatest examples comes from our colleague that works in basketball, and one of the scouts in basketball loves to use the term, "Well, that player's got a body on him." And well, what does that mean? Everybody has a body. What do you actually mean by the use of that term? It's common and it just kind of rolls off the tongue. Character is a similar one. That person's got a great character. Well, what do you mean by that? In some situations, grit is the important part of that character that you want to see. In other, it's empathy. It could be leadership. It could be any number of variables that define this thing that you're calling character in this context. And so again, it's not precise enough of a term. I think, if we're in a situation where we want evidence to be as high a quality as possible with data that is as clear as possible for or against a relationship we're trying to test, then tell me what you mean by character so I can design a better way of measuring this thing that you're talking about. Leadership is another example. I can say I'm looking for leadership, but what I say and what it means to me and what you hear and what it means to you can be two totally different things. And so, that lack of consistency in interpretation has implications for the kinds of evidence that we're creating, which is important in the way that we interact with young athletes in our program. It's important all the way up to the way that we assess and evaluate professional athletes who are trying to, like Katie said, squeeze out that last fraction of a percent that's the difference between winning and losing. These things have real implications. And so, again, just to emphasize, these aren't simple fixes. These aren't easy problems, but they're necessary problems. And they're probably ones that could hold our field back significantly if we don't try to get our heads wrapped around them.
What you spoke to there, Joe, reminded me of a conversation I had with Amy Price a few weeks ago on the Sports Psych show, and we were unpacking game understanding, and it's exactly the same. When coaches, for example, talk about players having a great character, when you have a group of coaches assessing the game understanding of a player. As Amy has found in her research, I mean, that could mean a whole raft of things, from perception, awareness, anticipation, pattern recognition, and so on and so forth. I mean, it's so, and actually her research is based around, let's define this in a clearer way so we can have better conversations, so thus we can make better judgments, we can make better decisions around individual development, performance, and so on and so forth. It's only fair to the people that we're coaching to have that clarity, it feels.
Yeah, yeah, and we see that with other terms, right? Like sport IQ or athlete intelligence, like those. Well, do you really mean intelligence in the way that you're using that term? Like it's standardized to 100% as the average. That there are different forms. You're measuring all the different types. Well, no, you're not using it in that context. So it's an interesting and engaging term that you're using that doesn't reflect the reality of the research that's been around supporting the use of that term for at least the last 100 years.
Katie, when you were engaged in this research, having competed in curling to a really top level, when you reflect back, there must be language used that probably at the time you felt the whole group shared that language, but maybe now you reflect back and go, oh, maybe that was a little bit ambiguous. I mean, I certainly know that when I was coaching golf, I was using terms that maybe the person or the people in front of me that I was coaching, they may have defined those terms in completely different ways to how I wanted to define that term or wanted them to perceive that term. So when you were doing this piece of work, did it sort of uncover some sort of past anomalies in your communication when you were curling?
Absolutely. Less about the curling because while I did dive into curling, I didn't make it as far as maybe I would like to have. But I think right now, like a funny conversation we have around the table is like talent's a swear word. So that because whenever someone says it, I end up asking them to define it, and then it becomes like a whole conversation. But I was very aware of maybe combinations of terms that I would always paired together when I thought about things like elite. I thought about being intensely focused and almost like not having fun in my those like my younger years. And I remember I had a coach that came in and really had to separate intensity and like concentration like from what I thought was just like grueling deliberate practice. And once I understood that like I could have fun, I could smile, I could laugh, like I unpaired maybe this like more regimented, unfun kind of component of my development. And once that was integrated, like it opened up another world for me to engage in sport. And so I think when I think about words that had held a lot of meaning, they were often just subjective perceptions from my coaches. Like I was using whatever they termed or had a definition for a phrase. And then I would kind of lean into that and be like, that's what this is. That means this for me. But I think because of how many different combinations of definitions there are out there for so many of these words, it gets confusing. So then you're left kind of thinking all of the different combinations of words yourselves. So ultimately, yes, I think just being really clear with my own language, especially working with students. I was a sessional lecturer this year, and saying things like, "Oh, what grade did I get?" I would frame it and say, "What grade did you earn?" Like instead of get, like earn changes some perception around agency over terminology and like their beliefs around what they can or may be able to do. And so, it's almost like infiltrated the way I think about so many things because I also appreciate that language is loaded and it shapes our identity. So I really think it's important that we're mindful when we share things in I call it like high stakes context, such as I would say athlete development or athlete selection and pretty much everything along the athlete pathway. because it does have important ramifications, what someone believes about themselves. As Joe mentioned, that growth mindset, if we're saying things like that are fixed in someone's belief, then it could really impact the way that they shape their own pathway in sport.
Changing get to earn sounds very growth mindset of you. I like it.
I certainly try. Sometimes it gets tricky.
I love that, and I love what you just said there, because it was making me think of, you spoke there about athlete development and athlete selection, but athlete experience. It was your experience. I mean, my experience of striving to be an upcoming pro golfer is very similar to what you mentioned there in terms of the intensity. I defined it as I had to be a certain way. And if I could get in a time machine and go back, I think if I had shifted the definition of my own development and all the things involved in my own development, certainly I would have turned down the volume of intensity, fun, enjoyment. And there you go. There's two words. Is fun enjoyment? Is enjoyment fun? And they get intermixed. And I'm very guilty in my writing of writing the two interchangeably, but I'm sure there is a difference between the two. Joe, coming to you here, I'm hearing that language is important for athlete development, athlete selection, but also athlete experience. So we have to take this seriously. If we are key decision makers in sporting environments, it's important to take this seriously, because phenomenologically, athletes are experiencing the language that we use with them.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great way of framing the relevance of the discussion. And I think, it strikes me that it's, talking to someone like you who's a consultant, and the importance of clarity and precision in language is obvious for research settings where we're testing relationships between variables. We need to know what those variables are, how they've been manipulated, all that kind of stuff. But in practice, there are situations where we actually don't want very precise language. We want the language to be interpreted by the individual. And I'm thinking of the use of cue words. I'm thinking of the question you asked Katie about language. Well, when I was a triathlete, we had all kinds of cue words that you would use for focus. When running up hills, you would use words like fluid and long. Well, they don't mean fluid and long. They mean a whole host of characteristics that you're trying to control at one time. So that's a situation where maybe you don't want to be that precise in your language. You want to be vague, but it's vague and meaningful to the individual using it. And it's, I think we see the similar one with the catchphrase of the day, which is be like water. Well, you don't actually be like water. Like, there's a philosophy to what that phrase means that we want you to think about, and thinking about that is going to elicit a response that we want you to get. So I think this is the complexity and the intricacies of this kinds of things. We need to tighten up our language in terms of research, in terms of evidence, in terms of policy, but not mess with some things that we know are quite valuable in terms of practice. Tough to get that balance right.
Well, I'm not going to ask you a question here. There's just going to be a bit of a ramble. It'd be great to get some thoughts on what I'm about to ramble about. But I think that was fascinating, Joe, because I'm thinking of that classic juxtaposition between, as academics and as practitioners, we want to tighten up our language because of the reasons that we've spoken about. However, you've neatly articulated situations where that might not be the case. For example, as a practitioner, as a psychologist at the coalface, most of my job is to listen to the people in front of me and to appreciate the language that they use. You spoke to attentional cues there. You're taught, if you do courses and qualifications in solution-focused brief therapy and motivational interviewing, it's asking the open questions to elicit the answers with the language that the client, the person in front of you, is using, and then reflecting that back to them. So that within them, they hold the meaning. And if anything, for me as a practitioner, See, this is where there's this interesting juxtaposition, because on the one hand, I want those concrete definitions because, for example, I want better, more cohesive conversations with coaches, for example, when we are having conversations about athletes, because boy, we need to be more precise. But then with the athletes themselves, I need to be very tuned in to the language that they're using in order to help them high perform. And a final thought there, you talked about shape yourself like water, or whatever words you use there, and it made me think of, the importance of metaphor. And you think of the great work of Lakoff and Thompson, metaphors to live by. 70% of our language is metaphorical. Boy, me as a practitioner, I use a lot of metaphors in my work. And these are important small chunks of information that are symbolic. That symbolism might not reflect accuracy in many respects, but it reflects something that it's small chunks of information, or small chunks of words that can convey a multiple amount of information. And again, that veers on the side of breadth and flexibility rather than accuracy, if any of that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's quite an important element to the discussion. And, the value of these kinds of conversations today are, when Katie and I ever get around to thinking about how we're going to tackle this with our colleagues, like, it'll be important to engage with people like you, as well as people with different epistemologies that think about language in different ways. Like, we have a very vibrant and variable field. We don't want to and that's great. We don't want to undermine that by saying, hey, you know what? If you can't define it, it has no value. No, it's in terms of research quality and research evidence. If you can't define it, these are the implications of your vague definition. It's not to say everything is infinitely definable and precise. No, we're never going to get there, but can we get a little bit better? Can we understand when two competing fields of research with different types of evidence are challenging each other, which one is more likely to be right? Those kinds of things, I think, require precision and consistency.
Well, as you say in your final remarks, we believe the field is at a critical juncture where striking a balance between vagueness and conceptual clarity will be a necessity to advance the field forward in the right direction. And finally, coming to you, Katie, well, what does the future look like here moving forward? What's going on? What's next? Where does this go?
I love that you're giving Katie all of these million-dollar questions. I'm so excited to see your
what
response.
The audience can't see is that I've sweat through my shirt, so there's that. But the exciting thing is that through this work, we've got to meet amazing colleagues all over the place, including you, Dan, which is really great. Our co-authors on the paper. It was just so fun to chat with Alex and with Adam, to hear their perspective from a different place on the globe. That was really cool, and to unpack that. So what I see for the future, and I'd love to hear Joe's perspective on this, which is it's so bright because we have opportunities to collaborate and to learn from one another and work with one another. We're trying to move towards one direction, which is better experiences for athletes, for coaches, for practitioners, for everyone is in part of that community, and that's what we're trying to reach. And so I think that there will be some competing interests, and of course there's going to be some friction points along the way, but that's part of it's part of sport, that's part of research, that's part of all of this. So we're buckled up for that, and great opportunities for consulting. I know you do some work as well, Dan. And often we're not there to say, this is the word that you need to use. We're there to ask the question, that famous saying, ask not whether it's true, but what it's true of. What does that mean to you? And how can we better help you with that term, that word, that metaphor, that expression that can help, move the needle a little bit closer to where you need it to be. And that's exciting because then again, we've got great partnerships. We've got more questions being asked and hopefully getting to a place where some answers being proposed. But yeah, I think the future is bright for that, for those reasons.
And before we come to you, Joe, for a final thought on that, and to build on what Katie said there, I mean, I would say back to you, Katie. I mean, I think this is enormously important work for so many reasons, and all the reasons that we've spoken about today. But not least from a selfish perspective, just having some resources where, if we're going back to that word elite and being able to sit down with a coach or group of coaches and say, well, look, there's a group of researchers here that have really worked hard to define elite for us as an example. And, let's have a really good constructive conversation about why we should potentially adopt this and have more of a shared mental model. I mean, there's a term that we haven't used today, and I'm kicking myself for not using it more, because that's ultimately what it's about, isn't it? Is having shared mental models, horizontally across organizations and vertically across organizations. See, the important parts are coming out towards the end of the podcast, which is my poor hosting ability. But maybe Joe, you could speak to that a bit to finish us off. But just a few final thoughts from you, Joe.
Well, I think you mentioned it there, Dan, that this is a conversation that isn't going to finish. We hope this is a starting point. And what was interesting to Katie and I, and Alex and Adam, was when we put this paper out, the number of people that contacted us and said, good on you. I've been struggling with these same kinds of things. If you're doing anything with this, let me know how I can help. And that was from across the globe, which was, just sort of emphasized to us that this is a problem whose time it's come. And there's a lot of resources out there that are there for us to tap into. We just got to figure out how to do it right so that we're using people's time effectively and not making a bad situation worse.
Brilliant. Fascinating stuff. Well, I can't thank you both enough for coming on and speaking with us today. Before you go, it would be great to get some idea of where people can find you and potentially contact you. Coming to you first, Katie.
I'm not a ghost per se, but my presence online is sparse. So honestly, Joe is like the beacon for this work. So like directing all attention to Joe for this.
You're on Twitter, aren't you? I think you've got.
No, I'm not. But I.
Oh, you're not. Okay, I thought you were. Perhaps I found it on your timeline, Joe. That must have been. I'm sorry. Okay.
No, don't be sorry. It's silly of me not to be. It's probably just a matter of time. I think I struggled for a second trying to figure out my handle, and I panicked and I left. And so it's not.
You left for good reasons. Okay. Well, coming to you, Joe. How can people find you? Because I know you are on Twitter. Follow you, get in contact if you wish to be, and also please do feel free to tell us where they can buy your Tyranny of Talent book as well.
Sure. And I feel like I'm responsible for Katie now. So any especially negative comments you want to send towards Katie, just forward them along to me. And if I don't get a sufficient number, I may make some up myself. But yes, I'm on Twitter at Baker J York U. And if you do a Google search for Joe Baker York University, you'll find my homepage. That's probably the easiest thing. I'm happy to continue this conversation with anyone at any level with working with any kind of athlete or sport. That's what we're here for. We're here to have these conversations, and I've never had one where I didn't come out the richer for it. So please reach out if anybody has feedback. The Tyranny of Talent, you can, the best place to get that is Amazon, unfortunately, the big behemoth, but for authors and publishing, their Kindle Direct services actually removes a lot of barriers for authors. And so that's what I tried with this book. So at the moment, that's the only place. Hopefully coming soon to Audible, but to be determined.
I look forward to listening to your dulcet tones in the car. Excited to do that. So brilliant. Okay, well, look, thank you so much to both of you. I really enjoyed today. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks, Dan.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.